thank you guys for inviting me. I'm really happy to share this presentation with you, and I hope you enjoy it. So my presentation today is From Muldraugh to Museum, The Unexpected Journey of Amphoracrinus tenax. Oops. There we go. Okay, so full disclosure, I am not a geologist or paleontologist. I work at the University of Louisville. I'm a professor, and I study artificial hearts and mechanical circulatory support devices for people with heart failure. And so I'm just a hobbyist fossil person. I like being outside and exploring and collecting fossils. I'm a member of KPS, Asconi, Dredgers, North Coast, and Cayana. And so you can usually find me on weekends at an outcrop somewhere with a group of friends. But because I have no qualifications in this field, I really have no business talking about what I'm going to talk about. So instead I'm going to let Amphoracrinus tenax tell you his story himself. Okay, so my journey begins in Hardin County, Kentucky. I was just laying around on the ground when suddenly this lady picked me up, and I got my photo taken, very first time ever. I was in pieces when that lady found me. There's the anterior face and the posterior face of the fossil at the time of discovery. And so, as we all know in this room, it's a crinoid, a marine animal, not a plant, related to starfish, and they still live in our oceans today. And crinoids have been around for hundreds of millions of years, and we almost lost all of them at the end of the Permian extinction event. And that's when we lost trilobites, some of the big brachipod species, eurypterids, and all sorts of things. Crinoids squeaked through and are still thriving today. But they especially thrived during the Mississippian era, so that's considered the age of crinoids. And so the Mississippian period was a time where the planet Earth was pretty jacked. You could see mean planet temp was higher than today, sea level was higher, atmospheric O2 higher, CO2 higher. So it's planet Earth really on crack. And the United States is sitting below the equator at sort of an angle, and here's the big ancient Appalachian Range that was created by several orogenies, and Kentucky's just off in the shallow sea, just off the side of those mountain ranges. And that's a really important location. So if we zoom in on that area and tip it sideways, you can see where Kentucky's sitting is just right off that range. Now those mountain ranges are always eroding, and so that runoff is creating a massive delta right where Kentucky is, and that's the Borden Delta. And so erosion, sloughing off into that warm, shallow sea, creating a big deltaic environment. And this is a figure that Ettinson had done. And so the Borden Delta is just sort of blobbing over Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, little pieces of Ohio, and just dumping all that plastic material into the sea. And so the region we're looking at is the Muldraugh member, and that's part of the Borden Formation. And so here's the Fort Payne Formation, which is a deeper water environment known with mud mounds. The Borden Delta consists of the New Providence Shale all the way up to the Muldraugh, and the Muldraugh is the deltaic ramp environment. The New Providence Shale is the pro-deltaic front, and then it continues all the way up. There's a shout out to Enrique's favorite layer, the Somerset Shale, and then the top of the Borden's capped off by the Harrisburg. And we see that in those layers today. And so again, when we talk about a deltaic ramp, so you can picture ancient Appalachian mountains sloughing off plastic material into the warm, shallow sea. And the ramp is literally just a shallow slope. And it can be very, very shallow, like 1 degree slope, even 0.5 degree slope. And they think that's probably how shallow parts of the Borden Delta would be. And then, obviously then it would dip down into a basin area. And then at the very top of the ramp, you'd have shelf environments and reef environments and what have you. And so the time period we're looking at for the Muldraugh specifically is the Mississippian. And when you zoom in, it's the lower Visayan. It's smack in the Arundian period of their European classification. And for North American, we're looking at the Upper Osagian. So around 340 million years ago or so-ish. Okay, back to tenax. All right, so Dan and Ben Cooper went ahead and spiffed them up. And Dan Cooper just won the Strimple Award, if you guys hadn't heard. Yeah.
It's amazing. It looks just like a trilobite once it's cleaned up.
That's crazy, with the borehole in the head. And so there's Dan and Ben Cooper's beautiful job, the original posterior surface, and then after they got their hands on abraders and scribes. And then I'll show you the anterior surface, before, and then after. And then was in pieces.
Gretel, how did they get some of this? Was it just air abrasive, or did they use any sort of chemical?
No, just all mechanical. Yeah.
Because some of the black is hard to get off sometimes.
Yeah, no, from what I understand, Dan did some of the crude work and Ben did all the fine work, but it was all just mechanical removal. And then a close-up, and so this is covered with an aluminum powder to really bring out the details of the arms and of the calyx as well. And you can see the ossicles of the arms and the calyx are still quite cemented together, which is pretty amazing. Okay, all right, so then these people teamed up to study me. So myself, my friend Stephen, Alan Goldstein, who you guys know, and then Bill Ossich, who's one of the crinoid experts up at Ohio State. Okay, so Bill Ossich and I in particular, we had to figure out what we had in front of us. And Bill really did all the legwork of this. I had attempted to figure out what I had in front of me myself and wasn't sure if I was going down the right track. And that's when I reached out to Bill Ossich originally. And so, you know, he could tell exactly what it is, but he's seen a bazillion crinoids and I have not. But it is a camerate crinoid, and the main characteristics I have bulleted, the easiest one is Mississippian crinoids. The biserial brachials will tell you that it's a camerate. And we know it's a monobathyrid camerate because there's no infrabasal ossicles that a diplobathyrid has. So we know it's a camerate, we know it's a monobathyrid camerate. And then it's just a matter of going through diagnostic tables that already exist in the literature to figure out who it is. So we know it's a Periechocrinaceae superfamily, and then it's, okay, well, what family member in there? There's only 4. And so it ended up being an Amphoracrinidae based on the calyx shape, the shape of the primobrachials, the plates. We can't see the tegmen in my fossil, so everything's based off of the arms and the calyx itself. So we know it's in the family Amphoracrinidae. And then same thing, there's published diagnostic tables of the genuses, the genera in the Amphoracrinidae, Amphoracrinus, Deletocrinus, Ectocrinus, and so on, and it ended up being Amphoracrinus. And incidentally, the very first crinoid ever described in the literature, back in the 1600s, was an Amphoracrinus by the naturalist Martin Lister, which is pretty cool. And he has these beautiful, beautiful drawings here of the calyx, which it looks quite similar to. And if you actually read his descriptions, it's fascinating because, you know, they don't know what they're looking at yet, and so it's really cool. 1 of 5 feet and things like that, which is neat. Okay. There's other Amphoracrinus specimen out there in the United Kingdom, Ireland, Belgium, the U.S., and China. Those are all the ones in that table that exist. But this guy doesn't resemble any of those. And all of those existing ones in the UK, Ireland, Belgium, US, and China, this is where they're located if you use a Mississippian map. Everything's south of the equator, again in warm, shallow seas. And all of those specimens are fragments. And so it's for some of them, especially the Chinese ones, it's very hard to determine even if those really are Amphoracrinus. We think they are, but it's hard to tell. But these are the existing specimens that are known. So we determined it's a new species. And so my friend Stephen and I got to give him a name. So we decided to name him Amphoracrinus tenax. Tenax for Latin for steadfast or tenacious, which we figured he had to be to make it this far. So Bill Ossich did cluster analysis and phylogenetic analysis to figure out who he's related to the most. And it turns out, of those specimens, he's most closely related to the ones from China. And so I have the Chinese ones marked, and then I have the US ones marked. The ones that aren't marked are European. And if you follow the simplest path of the dendrogram for the cluster analysis and the dendrogram for the phylogenetic tree, he's closely related to Chennai and Pseudoturgidus, which was really surprising because he's a US crinoid and other Amphoracrinuses exist from the US, so we had figured they would all be related. But the Chinese thing was really, really cool, and we'll talk about in a second. So, new species, we had to publish a manuscript on them, so that went into the Journal of Paleontology in 2001. And then because he's a holotype, he had to go live in a museum, so he packed his little suitcase there, and he got to go to the Smithsonian with me. He got to meet his new friends, the curators Jesse Nakano and Mark Florence, who are taking very good care of him. And he now lives in the Springer collection of echinoderms at the Smithsonian. And he's probably literally in one of those exact drawers, actually.
What made you decide to reposit it there instead of like in the Cincinnati Museum, for example?
Because the Springer collection had the largest collection of crinoids, and they currently have almost all the other Amphoracrinuses. So we figured he should be with his cousins and aunts and uncles and stuff. Yeah.
Springer did a lot of work here in Kentucky, too.
Yeah. The collection's enormous. Okay, so you can deduce a ton of info about Amphoracrinus tenax from his single fossil alone. And I would imagine that's the same thing. Any of the fossils that Rick has in front of him, one fossil tells a huge amount of information if you listen to its story. So, I was happily living the crinoid life on a carbonate silicoclastic ramp in the Borden Delta. So again, clastic material, silicates, quartzes, feldspars, eroding down from the ancient Appalachian Range into the Borden Delta, creating the delta. You have a tidal flat lagoon shoal. Tenax lived on the mid-ramp level. We know that because we know what the Muldraugh is made out of. So we know it's a ramp environment. It's not a basin environment like Fort Payne. It's not a shelf environment like the Burlington or the Cuyahoga Formation or even Edwardsville-ish. And so he's sitting squarely on the ramp, hopefully with a pina colada. And the Borden Delta may have looked something like this. So this is an AI image I generated with software. Ancient Appalachian Range, lots of runoff and stuff pouring into a warm, shallow, salty sea. And so I would imagine it looked something like that back then. And then tenax lived somewhere on that deltaic ramp. So again, ancient Appalachian Range, very, very shallow sea on a slope of as little as 0.5 or even 1 degree. Now, carbonate silicoclastic ramp, that's really common with crinoid fossils, but in today's world, and this was with thanks to Dave Meyer, he and I talked about this, the Lizard Island, Australia environment is pretty much the only place on Earth right now that you can call a silicoclastic ramp, with a carbonate silicoclastic ramp, where crinoids live. This is the only example. And so you can't see it in the picture, but there are creeks and rivers and runoff of highland areas on the island, and then in the little shoals and flats and ramps, there are crinoids today. My paleogeographic origins in China may suggest open migratory routes. So the map that I picked to show you guys of the Mississippian obviously shows a gigantic wall of ancient Appalachian Range. You know, that's open to interpretation, and so someone else's Mississippian map shows there are still some open pathways. The Rio Ocean haven't closed completely, and there may be little pathways here and there. And even taking a step backwards back in the Devonian, this path was wide open. So when you picture coming from China, the origins of Amphoracrinus, staying along the shallow ways, prevailing currents at this latitude would have been westward. We know he settled up in England, UK, Ireland, Belgium, and then he also has a presence in the United States. So it's possible that the origins of Amphoracrinus started from China and populated west. And it may again be that this model isn't exactly a completely solid wall of mountains. I may have been very colorful. And so really cool spectroscopy imaging of this particular slab of crinoids. You know, there's light white, gray, and then very dark gray crinoids in that picture. If you actually do imaging of them, there's fossilized organic molecules that are related to those found in the molecules that give crinoids today their color, which is incredibly neat. And so it's very possible tenax would have been brilliant too. Yeah?
Yeah, Gretel, the crinoids from Iowa, the Grand Iowa crinoids, you can actually tell different species are very obviously different colors on the same.
Right, I mean, just like these, it's beautiful. Yeah, yeah. It must have been something.
But you don't need a special spectrograph to tell it either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. My skeletal microstructure is not too dissimilar from human bone. And so crinoids have a magnesium calcite stereome. Humans have hydroxyapatite. Both form with different crystals that give it this hollow perforated lattice, so to speak, in different salts and whatnot. And so you have incredibly strong material, but it's also lightweight. It's not particularly dense. You don't have to use a ton of energy to keep up this type of skeleton. And then it also provides a ton of little attachment points for soft tissues. I grew in height by adding new columnals below my cup. And so if you zoom in on tenax's columnal or stem, here's his little internodal swarming at the most proximal level right under his cup, whereas the most distal portion of his stem, they've grown vertically, and then the entire stem as he matured would also grow in width. My arms and brachials suggest I probably had a dense filtration fan. So he has biserial brachials. It's an ecologic advantage because with this anatomical structure, you can really pack in. These are the pinnules that form his little feeding mesh. And with the biserial orientation, you get a really, really dense amount of pinnules per little segment. In contrast to this particular fossil here, you have 1, 1, 1. That's my really bad drawing attempting it, and again, not a dense filtration fan. When I was hungry, I did not face into the current to eat, and we know that from observing crinoids. We also know that from modeling crinoids. So this is computational fluid dynamics that Dynowski did. This is a crinoid exactly like my little cartoon, facing into flow. Red is highest velocity, blue is completely static or no flow. And if a crinoid faced into the current, it would be like that dog trying to drink out of the water fountain. The velocity is just too great. All those little food bits would just go right past him in the current. I faced away from the current, creating a dead space of low flow where I can grab food particles more easily. Same thing, the modeling. Now the crinoid's facing away from the current. Food bits are coming from behind, and then based on the anatomy and the hydrodynamics of the arm posture, creates a dead space, and you have even retrograde flow back into the pinnules and the tube feet, and you can bring food into his little mouth. And so I most likely acquired food by inertial impaction and direct interception, and I lived in an area with moderate velocity currents. So we know this. He was not a gravitational deposition feeder. He has a massive, probably dense filtration fan. We know the Muldraugh was moderate current. We know there were storms and waves. He got his food by having the food smack into him, being brought to him. simpler filtration fan. They tend to occur in calmer and deep water settings, and they just let the food drift down to them. And then also, tenax also probably lived in clear water. And you can imagine that really dense filtration fan with all those little sticky tube feet on their pinnules and arms. The last thing they wanted to do is get it clogged up in a big silty, muddy environment. And this is a really great illustration of some sediment and big chunks of food being dropped on a crinoid, and you can see he's extremely annoyed. So much so that when the big chunk of food hits his arm, he reacts by trying to wave it off, which is pretty neat. And so with a dense filtration fan, that would be a mess because he'd be covered with junk. Predators were around. So you guys have seen, Rick, you have a bazillion crinoids getting preyed upon in your collection.
That's one.
Yeah, there was one, that's yours, yeah. And more holes from all sorts of creatures, so they were clearly delicious. If a predator chopped my arm off, I could regrow a new one. And so we have that in the fossil record, and we have that as a modern living extant crinoid regenerating a new little arm. I could have developmental deformities. Like any creature out there, things can go wrong. This just coincidentally happens to be an Amphoracrinus specimen, 4 arms. And an easy argument would be like, well, one of the arms got chomped off. And that's actually not the case, because the arms are all at a 90-degree angle. Pentameric symmetry, a crinoid's 5 arms would be 72 degrees apart. A normal crinoid would look like that. An arm-chomped crinoid would be missing an arm, but still maintain that angle. This guy with the developmental deformity has 4 arms, and so it's almost like Mother Nature did the best they could with the 4 arms and made sure they were spread out 90 degrees, so he still had symmetry all the way around so that he could meet the environment. I could get infections. So there's a parasitic infection of a crinoid stem as a fossil, resulting in gall. And then this is a cyst on a living crinoid created by a worm. And so that's NO is new ossicle, that's the intranodal, and that's the nodal. There were waves and storms. So the Muldraugh is known for its lenticular bedding. And as you can see, these are either storm waves or just the normal current scouring of the seafloor. And so all sorts of turbulence as well. And so because of that, suddenly, bad storm or gravity flow. I was pushed over backwards, falling posterior side first into the sediment. We know this. The posterior side faced down and was excellently preserved. The anterior side faced up and was partially degraded. My column was broken, some unknown distance from the holdfast. I remained lateral when I fell. Unlike Rick's crinoid faceplant fossil, tenax stayed completely lateral on his side. I was buried in anoxic conditions very quickly. If you take a living crinoid and kill it and set it out outside, he'll break down extremely fast. And especially if you study the stem, the columnal is the most resistant to decomposition, so that makes the most sense to study. Within a day, the stem is already broken in at least 2 pieces, and so on and so forth, into multi-segments far out of 6 days. Tenax's stem didn't decompose, so he was buried within hours. But I remained close enough to the surface that my anterior face partially decomposed. So again, his anterior face was facing up, and this isn't weathering, that's decomposition that's been fossilized. I remained in the uppermost layer of sediment during the storm. We know this because the matrix is uniform and fine-grained, and that stayed right on the top. I died and was buried close to where I lived. I was not tumbled or transported far. We know that because all his delicate features are intact. His arms are intact. The ligaments supporting all those ossicles are intact. 23 centimeters of his columnal remained intact. Other creatures lived around me. One created a burrow near me when I was buried, damaging some of my arms. So this strange little mush here is actually a collapsed burrow that some little creature dug through, mashed up his arms, just going about living his life, or perhaps trying to escape from that exact same storm or gravity flow too. I'm a great example of the earliest phase of disarticulation. Disarticulation is related to the surface area of the ligaments, and the larger the surface area, the better chance of holding everything together. And so we're capturing, it's a snapshot of the earliest possible phase of disarticulation. The pinnules, the tiniest pieces of him, are mostly disarticulated, the arms barely, calyx not, and the stem was not disarticulated. The stem was in pieces, but that was the rock breaking after the fact. His stem was not disarticulated. I was buried deep enough so that predators or another storm did not re-excavate me. And again, all his delicate features are intact. The sediment on top of me was stable and did not shift during compaction. And so this is one of Jim Thalka's crinoids in one of his manuscripts, showing a beautiful crinoid. The arms are sheared off as there's oblique compaction and rotation of the calyx. Over time, I became a fossil, while above me more layers of sediment were deposited that supported my life. 340 million years later, creation of the Joe Crowther, Kentucky 313 in Hardin County, helped to re-expose me to the surface so I could begin this unexpected journey. Thank you.
So you've determined this crinoid is a male, so does it have a name?
We don't know the gender, actually. We have no way to determine that.
Oh, you just kept calling it.
I know, because Amphoracrinus it's a masculine gender of Latin, so tenax had to be a masculine name to match it.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't call him I couldn't name him Amphoracrinus cardia, for example, because that would be a feminine. Cardia is female, Amphoracrinus is male, so it has to be male. So that was one of the naming
Well, that makes
restrictions.
sense.
Yeah, is tenax. So just by default, since it's masculine Latin, I just call him he. But tenax could very well be a female specimen.
Yeah, there was a paleontologist here, well, it goes to paleontology, the famous geologist in Kentucky called Willard Bruce Gilson, who published a ton of material. But his knowledge of paleo was sometimes a little sketchy, and he found a new specimen of the famous sponge, Brachiospongia. And people made fun of him in the Journal of Paleontology because he named his new species Brachiospongia venomous instead of venoma.
Yeah, it has to match.
Yeah, it has to be the same gender.
That's right. Yeah.
And obviously he either didn't know his Latin very well or somebody didn't. But anyway, this guy, he was a really famous geologist in Kentucky from the 19-teens to at least well into the 1960s and 70s. He even ran for governor at one point.